and welcome to Mom and Dad Magic Box, the show where we bring together all stakeholders in education. I'm Isaac Carmignani. Today we are going to be focusing on school overcrowding in New York City. Now, we won't be able to cover all aspects of this complex issue today, but we will begin with a discussion on class size. In fact, we will be talking with someone in the forefront of the conversation on this issue. Her name is Leonie Haimson from Class Size Matters. But first, let's have some background. I'm standing in front of PS 69 in Queens. Now, this is a vibrant, bustling community in Jackson Heights, and yet this school would be considered overcrowded. Now, PS 69 is not one of the most overcrowded schools in New York City, but at least according to the New York City's Blue Book, it is at 121% of capacity. Now, what that means ideally is this school would hold 955 students, but instead it's actually holding 1,156 approximately. Now, consider that there are schools south of us in District 24 that are even more overcrowded at 120, 130, 140% of capacity and more. Clearly, there are schools that are very overcrowded. Now, what does this mean? How can we, on paper, say that these schools are functional, and we have it here in the Blue Book, and yet have a school that's designed to handle, say, 1,000 students, accommodate 1,200 or 1,300? How are the numbers adjusted here to make that seem feasible? Are these students able to get the appropriate amount of physical education, special needs services, art and music education that either the state demands or any reasonable parent would demand? Well, again, these are all questions that we will not be able to fully answer in today's episode, but we wanted to begin the conversation. We also wanted to provide some background and some understanding of the issues and the questions that come up surrounding this issue. New York City is a growing city. Changes to the zoning regulations in New York City have allowed for virtual cities to sprout up here in the city. For example, if you go into certain parts of Long Island City or certain parts of Brooklyn, you can clearly see that this is the case. But this raises questions as to whether the city will have enough schools in the next 10 or 20 years to accommodate this growth. Then we have areas like this one in Jackson Heights that have historically been magnets for people coming into the city and into this country. It's readily accessible to mass transit. It has a thriving culture. It is an appealing place to live. This has in turn led to schools being used to the maximum. Now, to the credit of these schools, their administrations, the parents, and the children who attend these schools are doing well and they're thriving. But still questions arise as to how effectively these spaces can be used. So complex and even contentious at times has this issue been that two commissions were appointed by the mayor and the chancellor of the city of New York to look at different aspects of this issue. And in October of 2014, one of those commissions, the School Space Working Group, released a preliminary set of recommendations. There are some who are saying that these recommendations can go a long way towards understanding and handling this issue in a much more civil and rational manner in the future. How do all of these issues relate to class size in New York City? Well, that is the subject of our interview, and I invite you to join us. So we have Leonie Haimson with us here in the studio. Leonie is a former public school parent and currently the founder and executive director of Class Size Matters. So welcome to our program, Leonie.
Thank you for inviting me.
So tell us a little bit about Class Size Matters. The name says a lot, but give us more.
So Class Size Matters is an organization that's dedicated to reducing class size in New York City public schools, where we have some of the largest class sizes in the state and some of the largest in the nation, and also providing information to parents, elected officials, and other stakeholder groups around the country about the benefits of smaller classes. So there's a lot of research out there, very rigorous research, that shows that class size makes a huge difference, especially in the early years, to keep class sizes small. And kids who are in smaller classes do better in every way they can be measured. They do better on tests, they get better grades, they have better disciplinary records, they're more engaged, they're more likely to graduate from high school and more likely to go on to college. And what's really important about class size is that it narrows the achievement gap between racial and economic groups substantially. So the kids that get twice the benefits from smaller classes are the kids who need that help the most. Poor kids, immigrant kids, minority kids. And so especially in New York City, when we have so many children of color and poor kids, it's especially important to keep class sizes small. Unfortunately, we've had class sizes going up every year for the past 7 years, and now in the early grades, we have the largest class sizes in 15 years in New York City public schools.
So how large is that in real numbers?
So the averages don't tell the whole story, but in grades K through 3, the averages are about 26. In other grades, the averages are a little bit larger, say 28. But there are many, many schools across the city. 1/3 of all the students are in classes of 30 or more across the city. And this is really devastating. In fact, the state's highest court in the Campaign for Fiscal Equity lawsuit, which was decided about 10 years ago, said that New York City children were deprived of their constitutional right to a sound basic education because class sizes were too big.
That was the DeGrasse decision, I believe it was?
Leland DeGrasse was the lower court, and then it was appealed all the way up to the Court of Appeals, which is the highest court. And it was their final decision that this was a violation of kids' constitutional rights.
So you mentioned the numbers don't tell the whole story. How is that?
Well, the reason for that is that the class sizes vary so much across the city that the average only tells you, what the average is across the city.
So the peaks and valleys, so the peaks could be much higher than the 28 that you're...
Exactly. And in 2007, as part of the settlement for that court case, New York City agreed and submitted a plan to the state to reduce class sizes in all grades to no more than 20 on average in K through 3, 23 on average in 4th through 8th grade, and 25 in high school. And yet class sizes have gone up every year.
Amazing, amazing. So what do we do about this? Because we know the city is a very densely populated place, particularly in certain pockets. What are some of the solutions that maybe could be implemented? Is the state money a part of it? Or?
Well, I think the state money is a part of it, but also the city has to be absolutely focused on that goal. And we have not seen, certainly the previous administration didn't care. We get over $600 million every year in Contract for Excellence funds as part of the settlement for this decision, and the city has never spent a cent of that money specifically on class size reduction. And even with the new administration, they have not focused on this sufficiently. Too many of our schools are overcrowded. We did a study showing that the need over the next 5 to 10 years is at least 100,000 new seats, and yet they're only creating about 1/3 that number. And so our schools are going to be even more overcrowded in the future if we don't expand the capital plan at the same time as hiring more teachers to reduce class size.
So class size, and you mentioned a report. Is that Space Crunch that we were looking at earlier?
This is the report that we did called Space Crunch, and it looks at citywide, but also in every school district in the city, what the actual need for school seats is, what the overcrowding levels are, what the enrollment projections are, the official enrollment projections. And, so we really did a careful analysis, and that 100,000 seat estimate does not include space for pre-K, smaller classes, or overcrowded schools to regain sufficient numbers of cluster rooms. Art, music, and science rooms. So that's a minimum.
So we're saying the problem is at least 100,000 seats needed now.
Well, over the next 5 to 10 years, because of enrollment is going to be increasing sharply in the future as well. In just the districts that are average above 100%, the need for seats, according to the DOE's own figures, are over 30,000, and there's going to be an increase of somewhere between 60 and 70,000 students over the next 5 to 10 years.
And that's based just on people moving into the city and
it's based on housing starts. We're having a lot of development across the city, and it's based upon the fact also that families are staying longer in the city now. They used to move out regularly when their kids were school age. Now they're staying in the city for a number of factors, one of which the crime rate went down. The city's population is growing very fast, so 1 million more residents are expected over the next 10 to 20 years, and yet the city has made no plans for all the new kids that are going to be living here. And it's really incredible when you think about there are thousands of kids in trailers, thousands of kids on waiting lists for their zone kindergarten every year. That just doesn't happen in other cities. There really aren't, people in other parts of the country ask me, what is a waiting list for kindergarten? They've never even heard of it, But here in New York, unfortunately, in recent years, it's become more and more common, and people are taking these things for granted, and it's really should not be allowed to happen.
You mentioned trailers. Now, that's those transportable classroom units that sometimes go in the schoolyard that we hear sometimes remain for decades.
So these trailers are now way past their lifetime. They're not supposed to last past about 10 years, and many of them are more than 20 years old, and they're rotting away. They're rodent infested. They're leaking. The city reports about 7,000 kids in trailers, and yet that's a false number, because actually there are more than 10,000, because they don't actually even report on the thousands of kids that are in high school trailers, because they say they can't count them. So the city, in its new capital plan, has promised to remove all the trailers, and they're paying $500 million just to physically remove them and recondition the schoolyards on which they sit. But there's not one penny specifically devoted to replacing their seats.
So now, where do you find the buildings? Some parts of the city seem so densely packed. Where do we find the space?
I find that a bogus argument.
Why is that?
Because the city has eminent domain, which means it can acquire any space or any building in the city for the purposes of a school. And I think this is one of the few actual ethical uses of that eminent domain, which the city uses all the time for private developers. In Manhattan, which is the most densely populated, in lower Manhattan, where the population is growing very fast, they've created several new schools over the last few years, because they've created them in the basement of high-rises, for example, or they've taken over parochial schools. I mean, when the charter school, Eva Moskowitz's charter school, the mayor was going to kick them out. They were expanding, and they were going to displace a school for handicapped children. They found 3 parochial schools in 2 weeks to lease for Eva Moskowitz, including one in Queens, one in Manhattan, and I think one in the Bronx. And it happened overnight. So they find the space when they need to. It's just that they don't want to spend the money.
And then there's developers, and so how about that? Perhaps mandating more of that if you're going to throw up a building, that you provide space.
Absolutely. There should be a requirement. Right now, in every large state except for New York, there's something called impact fees, which developers have to pay into a fund to create the infrastructure that is necessary to go along with their development. So whether it's water or
Right.
schools or roads or whatever, they have to contribute to the creation of that infrastructure. And New York State does not do that. And pretty much developers get a free ride here. So we have many parts of the city where the schools are already hugely overcrowded, and yet we're still giving incentives to developers to build in those areas.
I've also heard of situations where the school construction authority will look at a site and say that it's too toxic to build. I can think of a school right now in the city where across the street they had a vacant lot, and they could have built an addition to that middle school. Instead, it was too toxic to build on, and then subsequently a development went up there. Now, I don't know how that plays in or why that happens, but it is a question.
Probably the developer was willing to pay to decontaminate the site, and the DOE wasn't. But over and over, we have seen that it's a matter of priorities. It's a matter of whether they're willing to spend the money. Developers have even offered space in their buildings for the city, and the city has turned them down because they didn't want to bother to build out the space. So the planning has been it's a broken system. There is no good planning for schools. It's dysfunctional. And the overcrowding is just getting worse and worse.
And how much of this is a safety issue, too? Because you have so many people in one space. They have to move, they have to be evacuated if need be.
So we looked at the building code, and the building code requires at least 20 square feet per kid in grades 1 through 12. And the DOE redefined a minimum size classroom down to 500 square feet, which is tiny. And so only 25 kids by law, by the building code, can fit in a room that small, and we have like 90% of our classes are bigger than that. So there are many, many schools and classrooms across the city that violate the building code and that create a safety hazard for our kids.
And then there are many that have lost rooms like art rooms and libraries, and those have become rooms used for classrooms, and now that is just lost and not. It doesn't necessarily come back, is what many.
It doesn't come back, and then you have kids without real art, music, and science because there's no real room for it. You have kids, special needs kids, getting their services in hallways and closets or in the cafeteria. You have kids eating lunch as early as 10 a.m. in the morning. You have a school in your district with the class sizes of 46 in first grade, and the kids never get to leave the room even for lunch or gym.
So this really does matter then, I would have to say.
It matters hugely, and it is just unacceptable and immoral that in New York City, which is the richest city in the country, in one of the richest countries in the world, that we have kids going to school in third world conditions.
So 100,000 seats in 5 to 6 years at a cost of who knows how many millions of dollars.
Billions of dollars.
Billions.
But we can afford it.
But that's the real problem, and there are many that feel it needs to be stated as it is in order for us to move forward on this issue. Why is this worth it for you to do this? Is it?
I don't know.
I guess the satisfaction of
it's not always worth it. Let me tell you, it's frustrating. It's frustrating to hit your head against the walls for so many years, but I feel passionately about it. I feel passionately that there's nothing more important in terms of our future as a city than the quality of education that we provide our children. And the fact that they are getting cheated year after year infuriates me. And that's really what keeps me going more than anything else, is this anger, the anger at the injustice of it all.
Yes, well, it's a really important issue, and knowing, having looked at Space Crunch and seeing how deeply you dive into the data in every school district in the city is really amazing. It's an amazing report to read. I encourage anyone interested in this issue, as we all should be, to look into Space Crunch, the report. It's a fascinating report.
Yeah, it's on my website, which is www.classsizematters.org, so anyone can download it from there.
By all means. Well, I hope you get some downloads out of this. It's nice to have you, Leonie.
Thank you.
And look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac.
So for our community program today, we thought we would feature City Parks Foundation. And one of their great programs is City Parks Golf, where boys and girls ages 6 to 17 can learn how to play golf. It's free, and it's a great introduction to golf, maybe even for parents who've never played before. So again, if you have any great videos, great still shots of your kids learning how to play golf, feel free to share them with us, and we may even feature them on our program. So for our app of the week, I thought I'd draw your attention to an app called How to Draw. So it's a very interesting app, one I want to try myself rather than just drawing the way I draw, which is not good at all. It's basically a personal art teacher, and you can trace over the lines that they give you, and they work you progressively. So if you have a face, you start with the first line and second and so forth. And you can draw dozens of objects, and we would love to hear from you how you feel about this. We often talk about the lack of art in some of our schools. Well, this won't fill in for an art teacher, but it is something. So by all means, share your stories with us on social media, and we'd love to hear from you on it. And again, that is How to Draw, and it's available on Play Store and on the iOS store as well.
Hãy subscribe cho kênh Ghiền Mì Gõ để không bỏ lỡ những video hấp dẫn. Hãy subscribe cho kênh Ghiền Mì Gõ để không bỏ lỡ